Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, by Corey Brettschneider, narrated by Stephen Bell Davies. Introduction. The President glowered with unspeakable rage. The object of his fury, the source of his unrelenting obsession, was the National Press Corps. Each day, as the next election loomed, the media poured partisan criticism on his agenda. They criticized his family and defiled his public image. A man of impulse, he read scores of headlines, lingering on every insult, until his loathing consumed him. The president's party had sprung to his defense, plotting to undermine the certification of the upcoming election result unless he was victorious. But the plot failed when it was exposed by the press. Now he would have his revenge. The president summoned the attorney general and schemed for a simple goal: to lock them up. The president did not believe in equality under the law, especially when it came to race. He secretly lobbied the Supreme Court to deny civil rights protections, arguing they were not guaranteed by the Constitution. Publicly, he made clear he believed white people were a superior race. He invited racial extremists into the Oval Office and screened racial propaganda movies at the White House. All the while, he discriminated within the federal workforce, aggressively demoting African Americans and other racial minorities to keep them from serving their country in government positions. Predictably, his term saw the horrifying return of racial violence and white supremacist activity. By the end of this presidency, America would see massive violence in major cities, supporters drawn out by the president's rhetoric spilling into the streets. The president cultivated dreams of unchecked power, silently at first, then aloud. He began ordering his staff to surveil enemies and harass opponents. To bolster his fantasy, he peddled a legal theory that he claimed came from the Constitution, and emboldened by a Justice Department that pushed the legal powers of the presidency to near limitless heights, he announced that the president is literally above the law, licensed to reject congressional subpoenas or fire on a whim investigators who scrutinized him. Whatever the president chose to do in office was, according to him, never illegal. The presidential acts described in the previous 3 paragraphs bear a striking similarity to events during Donald Trump's presidency. Yet these acts were not committed by one president, but 5. Well before Trump, these leaders posed great threats to democracy. John Adams waged war on the national press of the early republic, prosecuting as many as 126 people who dared criticize him, including a newspaper editor and a sitting congressman, and lambasting a story revealing his party's plot to steal the election of 1800 by refusing to certify electoral ballots. In the 1850s, James Buchanan colluded with the Supreme Court to deny constitutional personhood to African Americans. A decade later, Andrew Johnson urged violence against his political opponents as he sought to guarantee a white supremacist republic after the Civil War. And in the 1910s, Woodrow Wilson nationalized Jim Crow by segregating the federal government, fueling white supremacist sentiment and racial violence. Finally, in the 1970s, Richard Nixon committed criminal acts, ordering the Watergate break-in and other illegal efforts to undermine political opponents that flowed from his corrupt ideas about presidential power. When the president does it, Nixon said, that means it is not illegal. Each of these 5 presidents stoked the fire of a constitutional crisis. Each wielded the nation's most powerful office to undermine a core aspect of democracy. And each stands as a conspicuous example of the damage a single president can do. The events of January 6, 2021, reminded us that the nation's system of elections, culminating in a peaceful transfer of power, is fundamental to our democracy. But American democracy is also about other fundamental guarantees beyond having one's vote counted. It requires the freedom to dissent from government policy, independently or through an opposition party. It means that legal and political rights cannot be denied to anyone on the basis of race or ethnicity, including rights to legal personhood, and more broadly to equal protection of the laws, guarantees of equal citizenship. Finally, it requires adherence to the rule of law for all. The president cannot be a dictator, able to commit crimes with impunity. Each of these three pillars of democracy is as fragile as it is fundamental. This book is about the threats 5 presidents posed to these fragile pillars of American democracy. But it is also about what happened next. Each of the crises we will explore was followed by a concerted effort at democratic recovery. These efforts did not come from self-correcting mechanisms inherent in the Constitution's structure. They were not the inevitable result of formal institutional checks by the Supreme Court or Congress. Instead, the efforts to reverse the damage done to United States democracy were often catalyzed directly by citizens with no official government position. So where did the authority of these citizens to redress presidential wrongs come from? In calling presidents to account, they appealed to the Constitution, the fundamental law of the land. They believed the Constitution granted them legal authority to restore democracy against presidents who threatened it. And they were right. That stance, however, often placed these citizens at odds with presidents and other public officials, including Supreme Court justices. Because most of them lacked legal training, these citizens played David against a presidential Goliath. Presidents John Adams and Woodrow Wilson were among the most noted constitutional scholars of their time, and were not shy in scorning lay people's understanding of their field. James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and Richard Nixon were lawyers who used their training to justify their attacks on democracy. In the process, they often sought to prosecute the Davids who challenged them. But the citizens who sought to restore democracy fought back, and they knew the Constitution was on their side. Because of this common strategy of turning to the Constitution to bolster their efforts at democratic restoration, I call these groups democratic constitutional constituencies. Defined by their use of the Constitution to oppose presidents who threatened the basic pillars of democracy, they sought to restore democracy by enlisting successor presidents in their cause. They thus relied primarily on politics, not litigation, to achieve their goals. These groups are appropriately considered democratic not only because of their defense of those democratic pillars, the freedom to dissent, equal citizenship, and the rule of law, but also because they symbolize democracy in its purest form. They are regular citizens, not public officials, and their authority comes from their reading of the Constitution and their ability to galvanize the support of other citizens. Each of the democratic constitutional constituencies I examine in this book succeeded because they convinced subsequent presidents to adopt their vision of democratic restoration, not merely to undo the previous president's damage, but to build a new foundation of political values that strengthened the constitutional order going forward. These democratic constitutional constituencies, the citizen readers of the Constitution, who played a crucial role in defending and furthering our democracy, therefore disrupt a standard story told by constitutional law scholars and political scientists, experts who declare that checks on the president come mainly from Congress or the Supreme Court, or locate the foundation of our democracy with the writers of the Constitution in 1787. Understanding the role of these constitutional constituencies reframes the story of the complicated relationship between democracy and the founding of the United States. Some members of these democratic constitutional constituencies you may know. Others are lesser known. They include relatively anonymous newspaper editors prosecuted by Adams, who used their trials to galvanize readers to champion the right to dissent. Abolitionist orator Frederick Douglass birthed another constituency seeking to realize the promise he read in the preamble to the Constitution, a multiracial democracy that guaranteed not just legal personhood, but equal citizenship. Another constituency, formed during the Wilson administration, worked to reclaim the meaning of equal protection, as enshrined in the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, from a Supreme Court and President who undermined it. This group was originally led by the journalists and activists William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells, who later passed the baton to other figures pivotal in the civil rights movement. The stories of these democratic constitutional constituencies illustrate the roles individuals outside of government have played in defending our democratic Constitution. Although they organized in different eras and over different issues, these constituencies shared the common goal of pushing fellow Americans, and eventually presidents, to adopt a more democratic understanding of the Constitution. They then mobilized to ensure subsequent presidents protected the pillars of democracy. But even the most admirable citizen readers sometimes fail. As we will see, despite the valiant efforts of Daniel Ellsberg and a grand jury to demand accountability from an authoritarian president in the 1970s, a movement never fully developed in their defense, leaving our democracy at risk today. America's constitutional history often follows this recurring pattern. A president causes a period of acute democratic crisis, which is then met head-on by aggressive efforts led by democratic constitutional constituencies, not courts, legislatures, or political parties, to thwart this crisis and spread a new popular understanding of the Constitution that enhances the democratic values under attack. These citizens, the embodiment of the preamble's "We the People," resist crisis presidents by appeal to a democratic understanding of the Constitution. Ideally, but not always, they also erect new guardrails and work with recovery presidents to preserve hard-won democratic gains. Through this recurring battle, democratic constitutional constituencies help to shape the meaning and impact of the Constitution. If history is any guide, today's crisis makes this a time ripe for constitutional recovery. In that sense, this book offers hope for current citizens seeking to restore democracy. The recoveries I detail in this book are not callbacks to some prior period of greatness. They are instead attempts to recapture an ideal of the Constitution that foregrounds the pillars of democracy, pillars trampled upon by crisis presidents. These stories of constitutional recovery also do not reveal laws of history, nor are they guarantees of how to stop a crisis president. They are instead a testament to the power of citizens to push past authoritarian moments toward democratic ones. To realize that potential for citizen success, we need to learn our history's pattern of crisis and recovery, and the role constitutional constituencies played. This book explores 4 periods in which a president threatened democracy and citizens fought to restore it. The first was stoked by John Adams, who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts and used them to demand the prosecution of his political opponents. In response, some prosecuted newspaper editors fought against Adams and made the 1800 election a referendum on his constitutional desecration. These journalists formed a constitutional constituency among their readers and followers that prevailed upon Vice President Thomas Jefferson and framer James Madison to oppose Adams and ensure future presidents upheld a constitution that championed the central pillar of democracy of the right to dissent. That recovery began during Jefferson's 2 terms and was enhanced during Madison's presidency. The second crisis was precipitated by James Buchanan and furthered by Andrew Johnson. Buchanan was essentially a co-conspirator in the Supreme Court's catastrophic Dred Scott ruling, which expanded slavery and invited civil war. Johnson sought to further white supremacy, even after slavery's legal end. A call to realize the democratic promises of the Constitution's preamble came from orator and constitutional interpreter Frederick Douglass. Douglass escaped slavery, only to later be literally hunted by Buchanan and denounced by Johnson. By arguing for his constitutional vision, one that rejected slavery and envisioned a multiracial democracy of equal citizenship, Douglass stood in contrast to abolitionists who rejected constitutional authority altogether. Backed by his Democratic constitutional constituency, he found favor in the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant, and went on to stimulate what historian David Blight called a reborn America. Woodrow Wilson incited the third Democratic crisis. Wilson segregated the federal government, nationalizing discrimination to combat what he called friction between white and black Americans, while also reviving white supremacist ideology. Subsequent pushback came from a nascent civil rights movement, galvanized into a Democratic constitutional constituency by William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells, and later by Sadie Alexander, the first African-American woman to receive a Ph.D. in economics in the United States. Alexander worked behind the scenes to convince Harry Truman, an unlikely civil rights hero, to set an agenda for recovering a constitution that protected equality, an effort that would continue during the Eisenhower and Johnson presidencies, spurred by the constitutional understanding of Martin Luther King, Jr. While the first crisis spurred by Adams around the silencing of dissent could happen in any democracy, the second and third crises were distinctly American. These 2 crises were fomented by the glaring contradiction born out of our country's original sin of slavery. The constitutional promises of equality and popular sovereignty, made when a significant proportion of the population lacked even the most basic sovereignty over their own bodies and destinies. The 2 different generations of constitutional constituencies would confront that glaring contradiction, demanding its resolution by appeal to the document's ideals, and using those ideals to hold presidents to account. If the right to dissent is essential to any democracy, the calls for legal personhood and equal protection respond to the distinctly American contradiction between the nation's founding ideals and its practice of slavery. The fourth and final Democratic crisis was instigated by Richard Nixon. The crisis Nixon stoked included the Watergate conspiracy, the attempt to bug the Democratic National Committee, which touched everyone from Nixon's plumbers unit to Attorney General John Mitchell. Less famously, Nixon threatened democracy through his criminal effort to silence Vietnam protester Daniel Ellsberg. Nixon's authoritarian understanding of the Constitution was effectively challenged by a group of grand jurors, everyday residents of Washington, D.C. But despite their valiant efforts to hold the president accountable to law, this crisis did not end with restoration. While Ellsberg and the jurors defended the Democratic pillar that no leader is above the law, no constituency formed around it, allowing the crisis of the Nixon presidency to linger to this day. This study of crisis and recovery, an account of the dangers of the presidency and citizen responses to those dangers, should bring hope, not despair. While we haven't reached constitutional recovery from Nixon yet, history shows recovery is possible through the efforts of citizen readers of the Constitution and the constituencies they lead. Underneath these episodes of despair and triumph lies a deeper question. Why does American constitutional history experience a continual tug-of-war between crisis and recovery? I am not the first scholar to describe cyclical American political currents. Yale political scientist Stephen Skowronek initiated the study of presidents in relation to their predecessors and successors. Some presidencies are defined by continuing the vision of past presidents, he argues. Others are marked by their rupture with that vision, changing the path of history. Skowronek thus highlighted the presidency's vast ability to alter or maintain the nation's policy agenda. Like him, I focus on crisis and recovery among clusters of presidents, but I focus less on the give and take of normal policy-making, and instead consider the relationship of the presidents toward democracy itself. The presidents I study all threatened to push America off the path of democracy altogether, a danger averted by recovery presidents and constitutional constituencies. These cycles do not happen by accident. They reflect a tension within America's constitutional design. The Constitution creates a powerful, central, singular chief executive, but the first three words of its preamble, "We the people," signal this power is granted through popular sovereignty, the will of the people. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, the presidency it created was nothing like the weak president that had existed under the Articles of Confederation during the failed post-Revolutionary War government. Instead, the framers of the new Constitution designed an office of far more significant power, making the president the commander-in-chief of the military, the chief executor of the laws, and the head of state. The president would lead the executive branch and would serve alone, not on a committee. The office's power would be vested in a single person, a unitary executive, as it is sometimes labeled. The framers robustly debated this design and its particularities. Alexander Hamilton said the executive needed energy to both protect the nation from threats and to secure liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. He believed a committee of executives, or a disempowered unitary executive, would become dysfunctional and ill-equipped to tackle the pressing issues a head of state must address. Influential voices such as James Madison worked to limit the president's authority, but the convention ultimately agreed that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, and to make this new Republican experiment succeed, the states would need a much stronger executive. Not everyone was convinced. Anti-Federalists who opposed ratification of the Constitution warned of the presidency's dangers. Revolutionary War heroes such as Patrick Henry predicted that the office was so powerful that a president with authoritarian ambitions could simply lay claim to the American throne, and asked the Constitution's supporters, "What have you to oppose this force?" Though Hamilton and the Anti-Federalists disagreed, both views help us understand the presidency's potential and perils. The Anti-Federalists illustrate the danger the office poses to people's rights. Hamilton illuminates its potential to restore democracy in the aftermath of threats. The presidency is therefore both a poisonous recipe for tyrannical overreach, lurking in each president's shadows, and its antidote, found in the power of the office when its occupant responds to a democratic constituency. Henry was right to worry about the presidency. Scholars often point to the difference between the American presidential system and more stable democracies that follow a parliamentary structure. Of the 22 oldest democracies, 20 have rejected the American model. One strength of parliamentary systems is that they are less rigid. Prime ministers may be replaced at any time by Parliament if they lose its confidence, a check against tyranny. In contrast, the presidency can collapse into dictatorship, a phenomenon that has happened often in Latin American countries, mirroring the American model. Despite the direness of Henry's warning, the American constitutional system has a check on the presidency embedded into its design, one distinct from the familiar idea of the three branches, checks and balances. This second extraordinary feature of our constitutional design is an innovation brought into the modern world in 1787, popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means that the legitimacy of government flows from the people, and from the people alone. As the Declaration of Independence proclaims, governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed. Kings claim a divine right to rule, but in American democracy the President or Congress cannot alone change a constitution. Only supermajorities of the people can. While such notions strike us as obvious today, our Constitution begins with "we the people." In the 18th century, popular sovereignty was a radical idea. As historian Gordon Wood writes, the early United States became the first society in the modern world to bring ordinary people into the affairs of government, not just as voters, but as actual rulers. Popular sovereignty, as initially practiced in America, was deeply exclusionary. We the people was mostly limited to propertied white men, with others forcefully excluded from exerting the power to govern. This reality mars the execution of popular sovereignty at the founding, where an all-white group of mostly wealthy men wrote the Constitution in Philadelphia. Still, popular sovereignty began to have meaning in the populace's first major act in 1788. Ratifying the Constitution, a proposition that was put to a vote in what legal scholar Akhil Amar has called the most participatory majoritarian event the earth had ever seen until then. We cannot today consider that vote fully democratic. Few women or non-white people were involved, ensuring that a select minority of Americans had a say in constitutional ratification. But out of the depths of monarchy, for those who were allowed to participate in the state-by-state process of ratifying the Constitution, it was a profound act, one that put we the people in the driver's seat of democratic government. As the nation's history began unfolding, from the earliest days of the Republic, the American people, spanning from farmers to bankers to laborers, later expanding to include women, African Americans, and others written out of the country's early history, demanded a central role in reading, interpreting, and arguing over their Constitution. Not for nothing is the founding document, a mere 4,543 words, a half-hour's read, small enough to fit in a farmer's pocket. Because people could read it, they could claim it as their own, such that all Americans, even the most powerful, were subject to its provisions. Even today, the Constitution ratified in 1788 remains the third shortest constitution in the world. These two ingredients, popular sovereignty and a powerful executive, are an odd pair for the same constitutional system. One calls on the people, a huge and diverse mass, to be the ultimate source of legitimate government. The other grants extraordinary opportunity to the executive, a single person, to act. To mix these two compounds in the same beaker is to invite the constant dangers of crisis, conflict, and recovery. Presidents have the power to push the government off the rails, crashing through constitutional constraint. Typically, these conflicts are rooted in crisis presidents who confuse their personal ambitions with the office's requirements, or in those who are overcome with personal paranoia or excessive fear of threats to American security. Often enough in the stories we will examine, their dangerous overreaching was couched in authoritarian interpretations of the Constitution that were actually fairly common among contemporary jurists and legal scholars. In fact, some of the foremost constitutional abusers were leading constitutional scholars of their day. They were not explicitly anti-constitutional demagogues, simply bent on seizing power at any cost. Instead, they appealed to widely shared anti-democratic interpretations of the document.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?